Alright, I just finished up with Principle 7, the conditions under which argues are at least as important as the arguments one makes. Um, just to expand on that a little bit, since I was hurrying up to get within my 15-minute limit there for part 2, just wanted to make sure that you understood that argument is a very rule-based activity in our society. Even in the most informal of arguments, we like to tell people that they shouldn't dominate the conversation or give someone else a chance to speak, or you shouldn't argue over someone, or you shouldn't be rude, or you shouldn't be abusive or offensive, and so forth. In that case, I think it's very important that you realize that as you become more and more formal and you provide more and more structure into how an argument will take place and the context in which it will take place, then the more likely you are to realize that argument is governed by rules, and the conditions under which you argue are just as important. And I gave that example of the courtroom where you're all ready to go and make your best argument, but the rules won't allow you to do it. Similarly, I was mentioning things like parliamentary procedure or deliberative assemblies. You might have had the frustration of being in a group that uses parliamentary procedure, and maybe you don't know Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised, and so you get kind of hamstrung, or you're ruled out of order, or a motion that you want to make can't be made, or you don't know how to navigate all the idiosyncrasies of making amendments or postponing things, etc. So it's very important. So think about all the context in which really sophisticated, well-developed arguments are made, and you'll see that there's a tremendous amount of rules about how the arguments are made. For example, in a courtroom, there's all kinds of procedural rules about making arguments and presenting arguments. In a scientific journal, there's all sorts of rules about the evidence, the methodology, the peer review, where it is published, and so forth. Again, I could go to any venue or any situation in which arguments are made or claims are made. There will be rules about how they'll be accepted, how they'll be presented, what kind of evidence will be allowed, what kind of arguments will not be allowed, etc. So pretty obvious, but very important rule that the conditions under which one argues are at least as important as the arguments one makes. Finally, principle number 8, we argue all the time. So does this literally mean that every waking hour that we are arguing? Literally, no. But pretty much, yes. Think about it. You're driving to work or school. You're having an internal dialogue with yourself. You're actually discussing things with yourself. Sometimes you're trying to convince yourself of certain things. Sometimes you're presenting arguments to yourself to rationalize decisions that you made. Maybe you're skipping a class and you're saying to yourself the reasons why it was okay that you skipped the class. Maybe you feel guilty about something you did, but you're making the arguments why you shouldn't feel guilty, or why your behavior or actions are excusable. Not only that, we're constantly anticipating situations in which we will have to have discussions or arguments or confrontations or disagreements in which we're going to think about the arguments that we'll make. Additionally, we go through or experience arguments in which we don't like the outcomes, or we don't like the way they went, or we don't like what we said, or we feel that we were ineffective, and so we kind of debrief them in our mind and think about, oh, I shouldn't have said that, or I could have said something else. This also goes on time. And also, this might sound a little bit silly, but I know it's true for me that you'll even have situations in which you're arguing in your dreams or in your sleep. That you'll recollect that the thing that you dreamed about was having a disagreement with somebody, and you'll sometimes wonder about how it went. Was it frustrating? Did you do well? Or maybe you did a very good job of arguing, but then you're trying to recall what was the very compelling argument that you made in this dream state that was so effective. So it's kind of interesting that human beings don't seem to ever turn off that part of their brain, that they're always rationalizing, justifying, arguing, discussing, debating, cajoling, thinking in terms of what do I have to say in a particular situation, and what kind of evidence or proof or backing do I have to provide in order to do that. So, so that's pretty interesting. And by the way, one of the reasons why it's interesting we argue all the time is that we live in a very argumentative culture. We live in a society where we're constantly surrounded by and bombarded by arguments. You hear them on the radio, you can read them on the internet, you can watch cable news shows and watch people argue 24/7. You argue with your friends, you argue in class, you argue at work. It doesn't mean that arguing or being argumentative is bad. It means that if you do it well and you do it effectively and you do it fairly and you do it with respect and deference to other people and you know how to do it and you know the rules and you know the principles and you know what's appropriate and inappropriate, it's actually a very important skill. And a lot of people who do it well become very effective at their job and their careers. So it's one of the reasons why we study it, because it's a good skill to have as a human being, to be able to argue. Okay, so that covers my principles from Chapter 1. Let me review real quickly. Argument is a rational activity, meaning that it's distinctive because, as far as we know, human beings are the, quote, rational animal. We do things differently from other animals. We think and reason differently from them. We write things down. We correct our mistakes. We don't make the same arguments over if those arguments are mistaken. For example, nobody's going to make an argument that the earth is flat because that territory is already covered. Okay, so we're rational. We don't get led into the same mistakes necessarily because we have this whole history of recognizing patterns and rationality in our environment, and we can move on. Other animals seem to operate out of instinct and habit and nature and biology in ways that they probably acted for long times. Human beings, not the case. Principle number 2, arguing is not just expressing opinions, so don't be an opinion monger. Don't say, I like to argue, and by that mean that you just like to be disagreeable or say something that's contrary to what something is, like in the Monty Python skit, no I did, yes you did, no, or no you did, yes I did, no you did, that kind of back and forth. Argument actually is a lot more than that. Okay, and remember, arguing always has a ground. In other words, the statistics, the data, the things that we're saying have to have meaning in a context. Okay, the fact that we're not grounding them would make them absurd or funny or ludicrous or ridiculous, as in this example. Arguers don't just express opinions. They make claims, and part of making claims is supporting and defending them. So to be an arguer, to learn argumentation, to be successful in argumentation, you have to become an advocate and know that all the tools are available. And once you make arguments, your notion or your anticipation, your expectation is that somebody will render a judgment. Some third party, some indifferent party, some fair and objective, impartial third ear that's going to render a decision about who did a better job of making their case, or who, quote, won the argument, if you like that terminology. Principle number 6, argument differs from persuasion. Remember that to persuade is to get an outcome you want using communication. To argue is to make a claim and support it. Whether or not it leads to that outcome, not necessarily related. That might be desirable, that might be something you want, that might be something that you hope is the case, but not necessarily connecting the two. By the way, a great example of that, I used some before, but a great one is that lawyers often make compelling arguments in cases, but sometimes jury analysts will find after the cases are argued that the jurors did not vote on the basis of the argument. They might have voted purely on the basis of an impression that they had of the people involved in the trial. So, for example, the prosecutor came off as arrogant, and therefore the jurors didn't like the prosecutor, and as a result, even though the prosecutor was making good arguments and making a good case for guilt, the jurors weren't inclined to vote for him because they had a personal dislike. So they were persuaded to do something different from what the argument was telling them to believe or accept. Principle number 7, the conditions under which one argues are at least as important as the arguments one makes. Again, argument takes place in settings, situations, and contexts. There are certain rules for certain contexts. Those rules do not necessarily carry over to other contexts. You need to know the rules for the context you're in, and you need to abide by them and behave accordingly. Otherwise, you're going to be disadvantaged, or you might not even be able to make the argument that you want to make. And finally, we argue all the time. Human beings are rational, and as rational beings, we're always using that rational part of our brain, or that rational faculty, which is inclined to always have us examine the claims that we make, the things that we believe, and how would we support and defend them. Okay, so in 3 parts, that's the end of Chapter 1. I'm going to upload these immediately, and I'll send you guys a link. Thanks for listening.